Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My thanks to the stalwart, the stout-hearted, the non-gamblers. Appreciate that you're here. You know, throughout today and yesterday, two words cropped up constantly in some of the discussions about money flow. And those two words were Panama Papers. So it gives me great pleasure to be able to do a Q&A, and I'm going to encourage you to participate in the Q&A. There are, as you know, as I say each time, microphones on either side of these two aisles, each of these aisles. And so please go to them. Sometimes it's hard to see, but if you jump up and down, we'll see if you have a question. And also, we have, again, our virtual audience. And I want to tell our virtual audience that you often send questions too far in. So if you've got some questions as they come to you, please feel free to send them in. We'll also take questions from our virtual audience. So I think the Panama Papers is something everybody here is aware of. And many of you in your banking institutions had to react to the Panama Papers and did searches as a result of the Panama Papers as to who your clients were and who they weren't. So it's with real pleasure that I welcome Ryan Chittum to come and speak about his role as a reporter for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. He is a former Wall Street Journal real estate reporter and a former deputy editor of the Audit, Columbia Journalism Review's business section. He's currently on leave from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, where he's helped report on the Panama Papers, and of course that is why he is here. He co-edits the Best Business Writing book series for Columbia University Press and lives in Portland, Oregon. So Ryan, what are the Panama Papers? Why don't we just start really basic and tell me about what they were, how they came about, and then maybe you can tell me a little bit about how you got involved.
Okay. The Panama Papers are 11 million documents from the Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca that were leaked to Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is a fantastic newspaper in Munich. And my group, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, they're a member of ICIJ. We had 106 partners in 70-something countries working on this project. And so they shared it with us because it was clear to them early on when they started to get the leak that this was an international story that was of great importance and something that was much too big for them to handle with their regional German newsroom. So they came to us, and we coordinate with partner organizations, newspapers, TV, digital in dozens of countries.
So this is a massive project, and maybe you can explain a little bit. I think it just is mildly interesting, or maybe even greatly interesting, to people who are sorting through lots of documents. How do you do it? There was secured servers. ICIJ kept this under wraps for, was it a full year?
More than a year.
More than a year.
Yeah.
So what was the techniques in terms of looking at this?
Well, when they leaked it to my colleague Bastian Obermeier in Munich, it was an anonymous leak. So he doesn't know, still to this day, as far as I know, where it came from. The leaker was concerned for his personal safety. He said, you can vet the documents, but you're never going to find out who I am. So and we did that. But they received the leak over something like 9 to 10 months, almost a year, and they kept it in offline on hard drives in a secured room with a sort of cloak and dagger as far as journalists go. We're not usually doing thumbprints and things to get into secret rooms and stuff.
Usually you're leaving the reporter's notebook out on your desk. And
I'm leaving it, over there actually at the table. You could probably go look at my notes. So then it was unstructured data. So we had our IT people work for months to structure this, and it was coming in, constantly coming in.
How many IT people do you need for something like that, do you know?
Well, we're a very poor organization,
right,
which is why I'm on leave. And so we had, I believe, 3 or 4.
Yeah.
I mean, in Madrid, in Costa Rica, and Malta, we're, a global organization. They're doing this sort of, the sun never sets on ICIJ. Right. And they did it by the seat of their pants, very cheaply. And they set up a secure platform so we could search it. And they doled out access to partners that they were confident would not leak the data to some, publicly. And so we had an internal forum. We communicated internally. We had an embargo everyone agreed on that we wouldn't publish until April 3rd, I believe it was. And it's hard to herd cats with journalists, but everyone agreed to it, and we were able to do that.
So, as you saw some of the raw stuff, and what were some of the things that struck you right away as you start to look at this stuff?
The first things that we saw, the easy pickings, I think, were the PEPs. So we saw presidents and kings and dictators and family members.
The Prime Minister of Iceland.
Sigmundur Gunnlaugsson was
very good,
one
very
of the
good.
big ones. Yeah, I had to get used to pronouncing that one. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, a French government minister. I think 12 current and former heads of state were in the files.
Right.
With secret companies.
Right. And so the first things that stand out are the PEPs, and then what next as you start to go through this?
And then you look at, people that showed up on, the OFAC list or bad guys. We're looking at sanctions lists. So we kind of started with the worst of the worst and the highest profile people to find out. Mossack Fonseca had a due diligence department, to a certain extent anyway. So we were able to trace kind of their process in some respects, going back through their files to see who they did extended due diligence on, and that was a sign that this may be a red flag. For instance, we found Rami Makhlouf, who is Bashar Assad's bagman, the Syrian dictator, in there, an HSBC customer. And Mossack Fonseca was concerned about doing business with Assad. They went to HSBC in 2011, and HSBC headquarters said, we know who he is, we're okay with it. And Mossack Fonseca said, if it's okay by HSBC, it's okay with us. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that was, that was one of the highest profile guys in there.
And so what did these papers show about the use of shell companies and how this is pretty much what we're talking about,
right.
Money through shell companies. And anything surprising or interesting or that you, ICIJ, you guys deal with shell companies all the time, right? You're always
right.
tracing things, so.
I think that, I don't know how surprising it is as just how complete a picture we got of this system. We've gotten bits and pieces before. The entire point of the system is secrecy and to be shielded from public view and even private view to a certain extent. And so for us as journalists to get this view of almost 40 years of files and in real time, sometimes we'd be in June of last year and we'd get new files coming in from a week before. And wow. So it was, what we were able to see is how instrumental shell companies are to concealing money, to concealing, tax evasion, money laundering, illicit funds. This is sort of the backbone of that system of secrecy that involves, banks, asset managers, accountants, law firms, and so I think it's not necessarily that we were surprised by what we found in there. It's just the overwhelming amount of, there's 250,000 companies in there, I believe.
There's a couple things I want to touch on with regard to the documents and the involvement of various entities in shell companies and the money that flows through them. And I think one of them that I'll start with first is, we're talking a lot about banks and how they facilitated this. You also have a lot of gatekeepers involved here. And of course, I've just come from we just did a session on real estate and geographic targeting orders, and we were placing a lot of blame there on the gatekeepers. So talk to me a little bit about what you saw in terms of real estate people, lawyers, and what it means for these, what kind of customer due diligence is involved in those sectors at the time you're looking at the papers and throughout the history of them.
Well, the real estate guys, for the most part, they're not a gatekeeper per se. They're using gatekeepers like law firms or asset managers or sometimes directly banks. Well,
that's actually the real estate code is that you're dealing with all these other entities that are regulated, so you don't have to do anything.
Right.
In the U.S., it's certainly that way.
Right. And I think that's a problem. You sort of touch on that right there, which is that the buck gets passed in the system. That, Mossack Fonseca, for instance, had, with bank companies, a lot of times they wouldn't do any due diligence. They didn't know who the beneficial owners of the companies were. That began to change, 2008, 2009, 2010, and even then the banks were resistant, but Mossack began to learn, like you saw with Rami McCloof, exactly who they were helping do business, who they were doing business with, and so I don't think they really cared so much because the buck was passed on to the banks, and
right.
They said, well, we're just registering the companies, so.
I mean, that is an interesting point because the papers they cover like a 30-year period.
Since 1979, I think is our oldest file. We have faxes and,
And so maybe some comfort that people were at banking institutions to take some of the stuff, some of the behavior may or may not have been illegal. Certainly a lot of it wasn't perhaps ethical. We don't want to let them off the hook on that. But the papers actually kind of show a evolution of banking regulation and financial regulation, international standards rising and everything. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, that things change in the documents, and what was once acceptable is shown not to be quite so acceptable. And
yeah, that's interesting. Over the decades, you can see what was a completely freewheeling culture begins to get more difficult. And I think 9/11 was a big deal. Mossack Fonseca was particularly afraid of the Americans, and a lot of the banks were afraid of the Americans. They didn't, they wanted as little exposure to the U.S. as they could get. And but the big thing that we saw was the UBS scandal in 2009, I believe it was, and that's what really freaked out the banks. I think that was the first time the Swiss bank secrecy was really cracked open, and there was a lot of panic after that, and the banks began to clean up their act. And I'm not talking about every bank, obviously. The banks that I'm talking about primarily, HSBC and UBS, Credit Suisse, SocGen, RBC, Commerzbank. Those are the main ones I looked at. But they began to, Mossack Fonseca began to require due diligence. The banks began to say, hey, we don't want to set up companies anymore for our clients. Because what they used to do was say, we're a full service shop. We're not just going to hold your money here, we're going to go, you need a tax solution? Well, we got these guys in Panama who've got these guys in BVI who will set up a company for you, and they've got fake directors, and we can get a foundation if you want an extra layer of secrecy, and maybe if you really want to pay some money, a nominee beneficial owner. And so about 2010, we saw the banks really start to back off from that. And you can see for a couple years, some banks were, I don't think they're really trying to stop the business. They're trying to get their hands directly out of it. So they would pass customers on to Mossack Fonseca or to other middlemen and say, we'll still handle the accounts for this shell company, but we're not going to set it up and deal directly with, you know, powers of attorney and things like that.
So, I mean, there was a little bit of a back and forth sometimes between Mossack Fonseca and the banks about who was responsible for the CDD, and like,
Right.
no, you know this person. No, you know this person.
The funniest exchange I can remember was UBS, and this is a meetings file that, you know, Mossack Fonseca came back in Geneva, I believe it was, and took notes about this meeting they had with UBS, which UBS said, what do you mean you don't know who the UBOs are on these companies? You're supposed to know this. We're going to report you to the anti-money laundering authorities in Switzerland. And Mossack's like, no, you specifically haven't told us who the beneficial owners are. That was part of the deal. And it caused this huge blow up for a while, and they eventually settled it. And UBS had to give Mossack Fonseca what they called due diligence light. It wasn't the full due diligence, but Mossack wanted to keep that Swiss business, so they gave them kind of a light touch.
Now, you know, I think a lot has been made of the fact that there were very few U.S. customers.
Right.
And maybe you can talk to that. And it's kind of strange because Mossack Fonseca, there were a few U.S. customers. And I remember there was someone associated with really, most of them were fraudsters that set up through Mossack Fonseca.
Right.
Somebody who, in theory, was running an insurance company that covered a boat in Lake Winnipesaukee or something,
Yeah.
if I'm remembering
Lake
this.
George, yeah.
Lake George. And tragically, the boat went down and there was no funds for insurance.
Right.
After that. But anyway, so talk a little about the U.S. Thing that there weren't that many U.S. clients, and yet there was an office for Mossack Fonseca right here in Las Vegas.
Yeah, I think, like I said, that they were afraid of the American authorities. They're afraid of the Department of Justice and the IRS. And so you see in the files Mossack talking about, you know, we don't want to steer clear of American clients and customers, but at the same time, they would take them on in certain parts of their business. So it was never clear to us exactly where the line was drawn there. There weren't, I think part of the problem, part of the issue with why there weren't more Americans, and there were a couple thousand Americans, but not big time names and not big political people like, you know, we thought and hoped we would find, frankly. I think Panama didn't have a good reputation in the US, first of all. So that was one thing. But you know, we did find Americans in there. I wrote about a guy, you know, a lot of sort of small-time fraudsters. There's this guy, I live in Oregon. He lives a couple hours south of me in Ashland, Len Gottschalk. He used to play for the Falcons back in the 70s, and a serial fraudster. He had companies with Mossack Fonseca, and you know, they knew who he was. And he said, well, what about if it's in my wife's name? Okay. So they would, you know, do that kind of thing. They're, you know, mortgage fraudsters, Marty Frankel, some of you guys might remember him, he was in there. So it's not that there weren't Americans, and also part of it I think is the taxes are lower in the US. There's more of an incentive in Europe to evade taxes. There's more of an incentive in Africa to squirrel, you know, dirty money out, I think. And so
other people have posited that you can, and I'm not sure that this would actually, I don't know if you've thought this through, because I haven't, whether it would really fill all the purposes of some of the shell companies, but other people point out you can just set up a shell company in Delaware or Wyoming or whatever without necessarily being involved with Mossack Fonseca and everything.
Right, yeah, if you want to buy a shell company, you can go online and pay, you know, $50, $100 and set one up in the United States. I believe in Nevada, they may have changed this, but you don't have to disclose the beneficial owner of the company. I know they were discussing changing that, but I'm not sure if that's the case yet. So it's interesting that Americans talk a good game, and they have had a good game. What's changed in the industry is largely due to the American authorities, and particularly post-UBS. But they're still willing to look the other way to a certain extent with money that comes into the U.S. To Nevada and Wyoming and Delaware, for instance.
Yeah. There's also a lot of people kind of wonder, are we going to see prosecutions as a result of what was uncovered in the Panama Papers? And I hear, I really don't know anything concrete about this. You hear that if these cases are brought in the U.S. courts, there's some questions about attorney-client privilege. I mean, do you know where the status and what we might expect as a result of this?
The last I knew is that the Department of Justice had opened an investigation. I don't know where that stands. I think they may have a problem with, if they can't use any evidence that we report, I guess, because it was not obtained. It's a leak. It's just, I don't know. I don't know if they can use it in court. I would suspect that they'll find ways of, looking at names and then backing into that. But these things take years and years and years. And so, this is 5 months ago, I think, that we published. And so I think we're still fairly early on. So I kind of expect that you'll see something, but it might take 2-3 years for it to really unravel.
So let me put you on the spot a little bit in terms of, this attorney-client privilege issue. There were, certainly there was a lot of outrage at Mossack Fonseca that not you personally, but you were the recipient of scurrilously stolen documents, and that none of us would want our attorney-client papers, our correspondence with attorneys, to be compromised. What was the, I think you were in fairly early on, what was the sort of moral argument about why you should go ahead?
Well, we sifted these documents very carefully, and we decided, and what we do is we get a lot of leaks. Typically, one leak leads to another. This leak came from Swiss Leaks, which was HSBC, which we reported in February of 2015. And, we probably reported on less than 0.1% of the documents we've seen. So we think if there's a public interest to this information, that we're going to report it. And so,
that was because, let me just understand, less than 0.1%, and that was because some of the stuff was really boring, or because of that, but some of it, there were also some moral decisions made about things you kind of checked, everything got independently verified, didn't it, that you ultimately used, I believe. There was some process, right?
Yeah, we gave people 4 or 5, 6 weeks to respond. We sent letters with questions, and so they had plenty of time to respond. Some people did. I think a lot of people didn't. They didn't want anything to do with it. But, there are some legitimate reasons to have shell companies in some of these structures. If you're in a in a dangerous country, you might be kidnapped, your kids might be, something like that. This happens, and so we vetted this, and we're very conscious of our responsibility as journalists. We're not going to report on, somebody who it's really no public interest in what they're doing, right? So even if somebody, I could rattle off 100 Germans who are in there who evaded taxes. They're small businessmen. I don't really see a public interest in writing about them. So, but if it's Rami Makhlouf, or if it's Len Gottschalk, or if it's Andrew Mogilyansky, a convicted sex trafficker, if they're PEPs like Gunlaugson, that's clearly to us worth reporting, and there's not really much of a hesitation there.
Right. Tell me a little bit about, one of the things that came out, and I don't know, do you know where this statistic came from, or where this factoid came from? It was said that Mossack Fonseca is actually the 4th largest, I saw that again and again, and I never saw it, I don't know how that was arrived at,
right.
But the 4th largest formation agent for shell companies in that in the world. So that really means that we're not looking at. There's a vast universe. We can go to that in a minute. Is that true? And what does it suggest to you in terms of how big the universe of shell company formation, some of which may be legitimate, as we've said, but a lot of which may not be too.
Right.
Anyway, places.
Well, so
the context.
As far as we know, and again, this world is, the point of it is secrecy. So, as far as we know, Mossack Fonseca is the 4th biggest company. They had, over 30 years, I think, created 250,000 companies. The biggest, I think, in the world is Offshore Incorporated Limited, which is in Hong Kong. There's a company called OCRA Worldwide in Isle of Man that's up there too. I don't know how much bigger they are, but I think, that Mossack Fonseca, and I mean, we had 300 and something journalists looking at these files, and a lot of us were working on it I'm still working on it for 16 months now. And I still find things every day that I haven't seen before, that nobody's ever found before. So this world is enormous, and it takes this sort of unprecedented collaboration that we did, and even with that, we're still barely scratching the surface, in part because the data that we have is so big, and in part because what we don't have, we don't know about. So, if anybody wants to leak me anything, my number, you can find me online. So
that does lead to the question. I mean, in addition to encouraging people to leak illegality to you, or to wrongdoing that they see, what was your impression? I mean, you'd be surprised. These kinds of issues are the topic of this conference in a big way. What can we do in the wake of the Panama Papers? And some of it is about protecting the institution from having a legal finger pointed at it, but people generally also have some moral concerns about some of the things uncovered in the Panama Papers. So what, from an outsider in terms of not being a banker and a compliance officer, what kind of struck you that you thought banks should be doing?
Well, this will probably make me, a lot of fans in this room, but I think compliance...
There's a back way out, I think.
Yeah. Compliance needs more resources.
Oh, well, yeah, that's good.
So, and you need not just monetary resources, which very clearly you do. You need political resources internally and governmentally. And I think that's, you could tell better than I can, of course, but I think that's happening in the last few years. But, and not to pick on HSBC, they do deserve some picking on. But their compliance woes, I think their culture is sort of well known. But I've talked to people internally there in compliance. They didn't have the resources. They saw bad things going on. They saw things that could lead to bad things. They knew there were things they might not know about, and they were told that, they didn't have the resources. In some instances, they were ostracized. And so, I think when you get these sort of, $10, $15 billion fines, and you get, the deferred prosecution agreements are becoming, maybe you're going to actually get charged. I think that will focus the mind a little bit, and maybe you're seeing more resources. But very clearly, compliance was seen as a cost center, and not. Now I think it needs to be seen as a cost saver. And so that's what I think, that's what I would suggest reframing AML as. And, I'm sure that's being done, but
right.
If your executives view it as this cost, and everybody is not only going to cost you money to be snooping in everybody's business, and the bankers hate you, and you're butting heads with them, but then you're also, the bankers don't like you because they don't get this business anymore. They're saying, no, you can't have that. So you're taking part of their bonus away. The culture has to shift to say, like, this is about the health of the bank as an institution, and about what's right. And in the long run, you're going to do better as a company if you put your best foot forward in trying to root this stuff out.
Wow, I think that's a really good place for us to end. You'll leave on a popular note. And on a popular note, I want to say, and you know, Ryan has not put me up to this. I don't know how many of you know this, but as Ryan said, the ICIJ struggles to stay in business and do what they do. You can go online and make a contribution if you are so moved. That is not an endorsement from ACAMS or whatever, but if you are so moved and this matters to you, then you should check that out. Before we close, I have a couple of announcements. There is the networking reception tonight at 5:55 across the way there. Also, I'm asked to remind you that in the exhibit hall tomorrow, there is Women in AML. I don't know why I have trouble saying Women in AML at 9:30 in the exhibit hall, and we encourage you to participate in that. And I'd also encourage you to join me in thanking Ryan for making the trek down.
Thank you. Appreciate it.